The wind carried a low whistle across the empty plains, a sound that seemed older than the land itself. The horizon was wide and endless, painted in shades of copper and gold by the sinking sun. Dust clung to the boots of the cowboy who rode through it, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the last light of day. He had known these trails for years, had counted the stars from the saddle, and felt the hard earth beneath his back on more nights than he could number. Yet nothing in all his wandering had prepared him for the nights to come, or for the woman whose presence would turn the silence of the desert into something alive with fire. He had lived as most cowboys did, chasing work where he could find it, moving cattle across rivers, sleeping in barns when storms cut through, and never planting roots deep enough to be remembered. Some men lived this way by choice, others because they had no other way. For him, it was a little of both. He carried a past he rarely spoke of, scars hidden beneath his shirt and in the shadows of his mind. The townfolk called him quiet, though quiet was just another word for someone who carried too much weight in his heart. That evening he came upon an abandoned ranch house, leaning against time with walls bleached gray by the sun. The place looked hollow from a distance, nothing more than another ruin left behind when the land grew too hard for farming. Yet smoke curled faint from the chimney, fragile against the sky. He thought about riding on, but hunger gnawed at him and the cold promised to be sharp once the dark settled in. He guided his horse to the gate, unsure of what he might find inside. The door opened before he could knock. She stood there, framed by the soft glow of a lantern. She wasn't dressed in fine clothes, only a simple faded dress, but the strength in her eyes was something a man couldn't overlook. She asked no questions at first, only stepped aside as if she had been waiting for him all along. The warmth of the fire inside struck him after so many nights under open sky. He removed his hat, nodded his thanks, and followed her in. Her story was not one she offered freely, though pieces fell from her words when she spoke in the quiet moments. She had lived on the ranch with her kin once, but time had scattered them like dry leaves on the wind. Some gone to the city, some to the grave. What kept her rooted in that lonely house, he could not yet say. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was duty. Maybe it was something she herself had not figured out. The cowboy soon realized she was not afraid of the loneliness that pressed against the walls each night. She had grown used to it, and perhaps even stronger because of it. Yet when the storm winds came down from the hills, or when the coyotes sang too close, she welcomed the company of another soul. He stayed that first night because the cold outside bit harder than he could manage. But by the second night he stayed because she asked him to. There was no talk of promises, no binding words. It was only the simple fact that two people who had walked too long, in their own solitude, now found a strange comfort in sharing the same roof. For 40 nights they endured the kind of winter that tests every living thing. Snow laid heavy on the land, water froze in the troughs, and the wind clawed at the shutters until dawn. Through it all, the cowboy rose each morning to chop wood, to mend fences that no herd remained to cross, and to see that the woman did not face it all alone. But the nights were what stayed with him the most. When the fire burned low and shadows filled the corners of the room, the silence between them spoke louder than words. He felt her presence near him, steady and warm, as if the storm outside could be held back by nothing more than her closeness. A man who had forgotten the shape of tenderness now found it in the way she set his coffee at the table, or the way her voice softened when she told stories of her father breaking wild horses. Each night carried its own weight, as though time had slowed to let them learn what it meant to lean on someone again. Yet beneath the peace of those moments was an unease neither of them voiced. The cowboy sensed it in the way she sometimes stared too long at the dark window, or in how her laughter would fade sudden, as if a memory had pulled her away. Wanted to ask her what shadow followed her, but fear kept him silent. A man learns to recognize when truth might cost more than silence. As the weeks passed, word drifted from the town to the ranch. Men spoke of trouble brewing south of the river, rustlers moving cattle that weren't theirs, gunfire in the night, a rider killed on the road and left with no name spoken. The land was restless, and it seemed only a matter of time before that unrest reached even the lonely house where the cowboy now spent his nights. He told himself he could ride on before the storm caught him, but his horse remained in the barn, and each morning he found another reason to stay. Maybe it was her voice, steadying him when doubt crept in. Maybe it was the way the nights no longer felt like something to endure, but something to treasure. For 40 nights he lingered, and each night bound him tighter to a choice he had not yet faced. The woman seemed to sense it too. On the 40th night, she stood by the window as the fire dimmed, her figure etched against the glow. Her words came slow, heavy with meaning he could not yet unravel. She told him a man could not stand in two worlds forever. Sooner or later he would have to decide whether he belonged to the quiet safety they had built together, or to the wild road that had always claimed men like him. The weight of her gaze pressed against him, stronger than any storm. He knew her meaning stretched deeper than words, that the choice before him was not only between staying or leaving, but between love and the kind of death that waits for men who walk the lonely trail too long. He felt his chest tighten, the fire's warmth suddenly thin against the cold creeping from the edges of the room. And there, in that fragile silence, the cowboy realized the nights that had sheltered him were not endless. Something was coming, something that would tear through the stillness and demand an answer he had spent his life avoiding. He had 40 nights of borrowed peace, but peace never lasts forever. The dawn was only hours away, and with it a reckoning he could no longer ride past. The morning after that 40th night broke in silence. The cowboy woke before the first light reached the window, the kind of habit no comfort could ever break. He sat on the edge of the bed, boots in hand, listening to the quiet of the house. The fire had burned down to ash, and the cold had crept back in. He thought about saddling his horse and riding out before the woman stirred, leaving the choice behind him, like all the others he had once turned away from. Yet something held him still, heavier than any trail dust or hunger. He stayed seated, boots resting against the floorboards, staring at the faint light climbing the wall. By the time she stepped into the room, he was already dressed. She carried a kettle in one hand, steam rising from its spout. She poured him coffee without a word, her face calm but her eyes set on him, as though she could see the thoughts he tried to bury. He thanked her, though his voice was low, rough from the weight of everything unsaid. She didn't press him. She never did. That was part of what made staying so easy and leaving so hard. The land outside had begun to thaw, the snow melting into muddy streams that carved their way across the pasture. Winter was fading, but with it came other signs. Tracks appeared near the barn where no cattle grazed. Horses ridden hard passed along the ridgeline in the dark. Strangers were moving through, men who carried rifles across their saddles and eyes sharp enough to spot weakness. The cowboy had seen their kind before. Rustlers didn't care whose land they cut through, nor who stood in their way. They lived off the taking, and men who lived that way always left blood in their trail. He watched the woman mend a torn blanket by the fire that evening, her hands steady, her mind fixed on the work. He wanted to ask her if she had noticed the tracks or the shadows that moved along the ridge, but something in her quiet posture kept him from speaking. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she had lived with that threat long enough to know better than to stir fear into words. When he walked the fence line the next morning, he came across a broken post, cut clean with steel, rather than snapped by storm or beast. He knelt, tracing the edge of the cut with his hand. It was deliberate, a sign left to remind whoever lived here that someone else now laid claim to the land. He stood slowly, the cold wind brushing against his jaw. He had no herd to protect, no family buried beneath the soil, yet the sight of that broken post felt like a mark against his own name. That night, the woman finally spoke of the land in a way she never had before. She told him her father had built the ranch with his bare hands, carrying lumber from town, fighting storms that nearly swallowed the roof, and digging wells deep enough to find water in a place that seemed determined to withhold it. He had stood tall against drought, against banks, against any man who tried to press him down. When death came for him, he left her with nothing more than this house and the soil it rested on. She said she had stayed not because she was bound, but because to leave would mean letting the earth forget his work. The cowboy listened, each word pressing deeper into him. He understood then why she had not walked away, why she had borne the loneliness of all those winters. She was not keeping a house alive. She was keeping a memory breathing. That truth gave him pause, for he was a man who had spent years running from memories, never daring to let them linger too long. Yet here was a woman who clung to hers like a flame, no matter how much it burned. Days passed with the same pattern. He rose early, cut wood, tended to the small chores that gave him reason to stay. Each evening the silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. Yet the world outside grew louder, A gunshot carried faint on the wind one afternoon, far but clear enough to stir his nerves. The following morning, he found a horseshoe print sunk deep near the creek, too fresh to ignore. Someone was drawing closer. The townsfolk had warned of violence creeping north, but the cowboy had learned long ago that words from town always came softer than the truth. Men who lived by the gun didn't announce themselves until it was too late. He began to keep his rifle closer, his revolver strapped even when doing simple work. She noticed, of course, though she made no mention of it. Her silence said enough. One evening, as the sun burned low and cast the land in red, she spoke in a voice that seemed steadier than the fire itself. She told him of a night years ago when riders had come to the ranch. She had been young then, and her father had sent her inside, while he faced them at the gate. She never knew what was said, but when morning came, 3 bodies lay cold in the dirt, and her father carried a wound that never fully healed. She had lived with the knowledge since that day that this land had been marked, that sooner or later men would return to claim what was not theirs. The cowboy stared into the flames, the story cutting through him. It wasn't only loneliness that filled the walls of this house, but history soaked in blood and duty. He understood then that the choice looming over him was more than whether he stayed with her or rode on. If he stayed, he was taking on a fight that might not end until the earth itself swallowed him. If he left, he would abandon her to face it alone, just as those riders had once tried to force upon her father. The nights grew heavier with the weight of that truth. He lay awake, listening for sounds beyond the crackle of the fire. Every creak of the floorboards, every scrape of the wind against the shutters, set his hand toward the weapon near his bed. He found himself pacing the house at times, checking windows, stepping onto the porch to scan the horizon. Still the land stayed quiet, too quiet for what he knew was coming. She began to watch him differently, with an understanding that made his chest ache. She knew he was torn. She could see it in the way his eyes drifted to the barn when the horse shifted restlessly, in the way his words faltered when talk turned to the future. Yet she never begged him to stay, never asked him to promise more than he could give. That restraint made the bond between them stronger and the weight of his choice heavier. When spring finally broke through, the air carried the smell of wet earth and growing things.
Ow.
The thaw had ended, but the tension had not. Tracks appeared again, more this time, circling the land. Lantern flickered on the ridge one night, held by someone watching from a distance. The cowboy spotted it as he stepped outside, his breath sharp in the cold. He didn't raise his rifle, not yet. Whoever it was wanted to be seen. It was a message, plain as any words could be. He carried the sight of that lantern back inside, his jaw tight. She looked up from her chair by the fire, her sewing paused in her lap. He didn't speak, but she read the answer in his silence. Something was drawing near, something neither of them could avoid, and so the nights continued, each one pressing tighter against them. The cowboy could feel the land holding its breath, the quiet before the storm. He had lived long enough to know that peace like this never lasted, that men who lived by the gun would come soon enough to test the strength of the ranch, of the woman, and of himself. He lay awake once more, staring at the beams above him, the sound of her breathing steady in the room beside him. He thought of the words she had spoken on that 40th night, about how no man could stand in 2 worlds forever, and the choice was drawing near, and the cost of it pressed harder with each passing day. Dawn would come again, and with it, perhaps, the reckoning that had been waiting all along. The next days blurred into one another. Each dawn heavy with the feeling that something unseen had already stepped onto the land. The cowboy kept his rifle nearer and his horse saddled more often than not, though he still went about the simple work that gave shape to the hours. He patched the roof where snow had weighed it down, tightened hinges that the wind had loosened, and repaired the wagon wheels, though there was no wagon left to pull. The woman watched him quietly, sometimes helping, sometimes keeping to her sewing, always carrying that same calm weight in her eyes. It was as if she knew the storm was close, but had lived long enough with danger to no longer flinch at its shadow. One afternoon he rode into town for supplies. He had put it off for weeks, wary of leaving her alone, but the flour barrel was low, and the lantern oil nearly gone. The ride took most of the morning, the trail muddy, and the rivers swollen with spring melt. When he reached the edge of town, he saw signs of the trouble that had been drifting north. The saloon doors swung open to men with rifles slung careless across their backs, men whose eyes narrowed as they watched strangers ride in. A wagon stood broken in the street, its driver arguing with two riders who seemed more interested in the goods inside than in helping mend a wheel. The cowboy kept his head low, reined his horse toward the mercantile, and did not linger. He heard enough in the snatches of talk that carried through the street. Rustlers had driven cattle off a ranch near the river. Storehouse had been broken into, barrels of grain taken in the night. A sheriff had come to put a stop to it. Folks muttered about lawmen looking the other way, or worse, taking coin to keep their eyes shut. Trouble had taken root, and men without conscience were letting it spread. Inside the store, he gathered flour, salt, coffee, and oil. His silence unbroken, save for a brief nod at the shopkeeper. The man glanced toward the door before speaking low. He warned that riders had been asking about the ranch lands north, asking who still lived there and whether the ground was worth the fight. The cowboy felt the weight of those words settle deep, though his face showed none of it. He paid, loaded his goods, and rode back before the sun dipped too low, every mile heavy with the thought that danger was no longer a whisper, but a certainty. When he returned, the woman stood on the porch, her gaze fixed on the ridge. She didn't ask about town, and he didn't speak of it. Some truths didn't need repeating. Instead, he carried the supplies inside and set about his tasks. Though his movements were sharper, his silence thicker than before. She watched him a long moment, then set her hand lightly on his arm. That touch steadied him in ways words could not. The following nights grew restless. Coyotes sang louder than before, and once, near midnight, he heard the faint echo of hooves on the far ridge. He rose, rifle in hand, and stepped onto the porch. The moon laid a silver path across the land, empty save for the trees swaying in the wind. Still, he felt the certainty of eyes watching from the dark. He stayed outside until the chill seeped into his bones, then returned inside, though sleep never came easy. In those sleepless hours, his mind wandered to pieces of his past he had long tried to bury. There had been another ranch once, far to the south, where he had worked a season. He had left after a fight with men much like the ones now prowling near. That fight had ended in gunfire, and though he had survived, others had not. The memory weighed heavy, not only for the blood spilled, but for the way he had ridden away the next morning without looking back.
Ow.
He had told himself it was the only choice, yet here he was again, facing the same storm on different land. The woman's past was no less tangled. One night, as the fire burned low, she told him of her brother. He had left years ago, chasing gold in the mountains. Letters had come for a while, then stopped. Rumors drifted back later, whispers of his name tied to men who robbed coaches and drank hard in border towns. She did not know if he lived, or if the land had already claimed him. Still, she carried the ache of not knowing, the ache of blood bound to her by memory even if not by presence. The cowboy saw in her story the same kind of wound he carried, the kind that never quite healed no matter how much time passed. Spring stretched on, each day brighter, each night heavier. Work filled the daylight, but tension filled the dark. Then, one evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a rider appeared. He came slow, hat pulled low, horse lathered from the trail. The cowboy stepped onto the porch, rifle resting across his arm, and waited. The rider stopped short of the gate, lifted his head, and called out in a voice that carried. He said he was looking for water, that his horse was spent. The cowboy studied him a long moment before answering. The woman stood just inside the door, her hand near the latch. The rider dismounted, led his horse to the trough, and drank deep himself. His eyes darted over the house, the barn, the fields. Lee spoke little, but his silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a man measuring what he saw. When he left, the air felt heavier, as though he had carried news back with him to others waiting in the shadows. That night, the woman asked if he believed the rider would return. He said yes, though the word carried more weight than a single syllable should. She nodded, her face steady, though her hands gripped the edge of her chair. Neither spoke further, but the truth hung between them. The quiet days were gone. Days later, the first real sign came. Calf carcass lay near the creek, throat slit, left not for food but for message. The cowboy buried it beneath the earth, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. He had seen such things before, knew them for what they were. It was not hunger that drove men to such cruelty, but the desire to show their power. The woman stood near the porch as he worked, her figure strong against the fading light. She had lived long enough to know that land marked in blood would not remain untouched. The cowboy began setting watch at night. He sat near the barn, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. Sometimes he thought he saw movement, shadows where none should be, but the night gave no answers. His horse grew restless, ears twitching at sounds too faint for human hearing. Even the wind seemed to carry a warning now. In those long hours of watching, he thought of what choice lay before him. He could ride away as he had done before, leaving the land and the woman to their fate, or he could stay and fight, though he knew well how such fights often ended. He thought of the graves he had seen across the plains, marked by wood already splintering in the weather. He thought of the silence that followed gunfire, and the way the world moved on without those who had fallen. But he also thought of her, of the strength in her eyes when she spoke of her father, of the steadiness in her voice when she told him no man could live in two worlds forever. He thought of the warmth of the house after years of cold trails, of the way 40 nights had taught him what it meant to share silence rather than run from it. Those thoughts weighed heavier than fear, though fear still held its place. The days stretched thinner, the tension wound tighter. The cowboy knew it was only a matter of time before the riders came, not for water or to leave messages, but to claim what they wanted in full. He could feel the land bracing for it, the way animals braced before a storm, the way the air held still before lightning split the sky. Each morning he rose, each night he kept watch, the waiting carving deeper into him. The woman moved with the same quiet strength, though her gaze often drifted to the horizon, as if searching for the shape of what was coming. Together, they lived in that fragile balance, each breath a reminder that the choice was drawing closer. The land was no longer simply a home or a memory. It had become a stage for a conflict neither could avoid. And as the days slipped by, the cowboy knew the reckoning was not just about rustlers or land, it was about what kind of man he would choose to be when the storm finally broke. The days grew warmer, but the warmth carried no comfort. It was a fall spring, the kind that made the air sweet but left the ground uneasy. The cowboy felt it in his bones, the way a man feels rain before it comes. The land was holding its breath. The silence that once made the ranch peaceful had turned sharp, like the pause between a rattler's coil and strike. He could see it in the way the woman moved through the house, quiet but restless, as though she too heard the drum of hooves in the distance long before they arrived. The first true warning came at dusk. He had walked to the barn to settle the horse. When a sound cut through the evening calm, it was faint at first. A low murmur that grew into laughter carried on the wind. More than one voice, more than one rider. He stepped to the barn door, eyes scanning the ridge. The sun was sinking low, the land red with its glow, but along the crest he saw them, shadows on horseback, lined against the horizon, watching. They made no move to ride down. They simply sat there, still as stones, before turning their horses and vanishing into the falling night. The cowboy stayed outside long after they were gone. He lit no lantern, stood in the dark, and waited. His hand rested on the rifle at his side, his chest heavy with the knowledge that the waiting was nearly done. When he returned to the house, the woman was at the window. She didn't ask what he had seen, and he didn't speak of it. Some truths hung so heavy they didn't need words. That night he kept to the porch, sitting in the old chair with his rifle balanced across his knees. The stars stretched wide, the wind moving soft, yet every sound set his nerves taut. Once he thought he heard a whisper of hooves, far off and quick. Another time he swore he saw a figure slip across the lower field, but the dark swallowed it before he could be sure. He stayed awake until the first light reached the horizon, only then letting his eyes close for a moment. Sleep brought no rest. The days after that fell into a rhythm of preparation. Fixed the door latches, tightened the shutters, stacked firewood near the porch, though the weather no longer called for it. He checked the rifle, checked the revolver, counted the rounds, and counted them again. The woman moved quietly around him, helping in small ways, her face set firm, though her eyes told of the weight she carried. She did not ask him to stay, nor tell him to go. She simply stood beside him, as steady as the land itself. He thought often of riding into town to call for help, but he knew what he would find. The townsfolk had already given up. Men had families to protect, and families did not fight wars for land that was not theirs. The law had turned its back, bought or frightened into silence. Out here, they were alone. And out here, being alone meant a man's will was tested to its fullest. One evening, he sat by the fire while she mended a torn shirt. He asked her almost against his own nature if she feared what was coming. She paused, needle in hand, and looked at him steady. She said fear had been part of her life for as long as she remembered. The land taught it, the wind taught it, men taught it. Fear was not new. What mattered was whether a person let fear bend them or kept standing in spite of it. Her words sank deep, steadying him even as they reminded him of the storm pressing closer. That night, the riders came nearer. He heard them just past midnight, their voices carrying through the dark. Laughter again, rough and sharp, mixed with the creak of leather and the clatter of hooves. They circled the edge of the field, close enough to stir the horse in the barn, close enough for the woman to rise from her bed and move to the window. He stepped outside with the rifle in hand, standing tall in the moonlight where they could see him. For a moment the voices fell silent. Then one rider let out a long whistle, mocking and cold, before the group turned and rode off into the hills. The cowboys stood in the yard long after they were gone, the weight of their message clear. They were testing him, testing the house, testing the woman's will, and they would be back. The land was theirs only so long as he stood in its defense. The next day he rode the perimeter of the property. Tracks scarred the earth where the riders had circled, deep and careless. He found another sign near the creek, a tree carved with a mark he recognized. It was a sign left by rustlers, a claim that the land was theirs to take. He traced the carving with his hand, jaw tight, then rode back to the house. The woman waited on the porch, watching him approach. He didn't need to speak. She saw the truth in his eyes. She nodded once, her shoulders squared, as if readying herself for what lay ahead. Together they carried water inside, closed the shutters, and made ready without a word. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with understanding. That night the waiting grew sharper. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every gust of wind like a warning. He paced from window to door, rifle never far from his reach. She sat by the fire, the light casting shadows across her face, her sewing left untouched in her lap. They spoke little, but their eyes met often, each glance carrying all the words that needed saying. Near midnight, the dogs from a distant farm began to bark. The sound carried across the hills, sharp and urgent. The cowboy stepped to the porch, heart heavy, eyes scanning the dark horizon. The night air was still, yet the sense of movement pressed against him like a hand. He could feel them out there, waiting, circling, drawing closer with each hour. He thought of the trail of the life he had lived before, thought of all the times he had chosen to ride on rather than face the storm. He knew that choice no longer stood before him. The storm was here, and he was tied to it, bound by the land, by the woman, by the nights they had shared. The woman joined him on the porch, standing at his side. She looked out over the dark fields, her face calm, though her hands were clenched. She said only that the land was worth fighting for, not because of the soil or the boards of the house, but because of what it meant to stand and not be broken. Her words cut deeper than any blade, for he knew they were true. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke. The cowboy stiffened, scanning the horizon. Far to the south, a glow rose against the night, small at first but growing. A barn, a house, something burning. The riders were close, and they were already leaving their mark. The glow stained the night sky, a silent warning that the reckoning was no longer distant. He gripped the rifle tighter, his chest heavy with the weight of what was to come. The woman stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the fire in the distance. Neither spoke. Words had no place here. Only the silence of two souls waiting for dawn, waiting for the storm to break, waiting for the fight that would decide not only the land, but who they truly were when tested by fire and steel. And as the glow spread across the horizon, painting the night with its warning, the cowboy knew the time for waiting was nearly done. The conflict that had haunted the edges of their days was now at their door, and there would be no turning away. The storm was coming, and it would not pass quietly. The glow on the horizon grew through the night, spreading smoke across the hills until the sky itself looked bruised. The cowboy stood on the porch until his legs ached, waiting for the fire to fade or for the riders to come. Neither happened. The woman remained beside him, steady in her silence. When dawn broke, the field stretched quiet, as though the land was bracing itself for what was certain to come next. The morning air smelled of ash, carried on the wind from the south. The cowboy saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge to see what the night had left behind, From the crest he saw the truth. Neighbor's barn lay in ruins, black smoke still curling from the timbers. The land around it was trampled by hooves, deep scars marking where riders had circled like wolves. He sat still for a long while, hand heavy on the reins. He had seen such signs before and knew they always pointed to the same end. When he returned to the ranch, the woman was waiting. He told her what he had seen. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes. She only nodded, as though she had expected it all along. Together they walked the fence line that day, checking the posts, tightening the wire, even though they both knew wood and wire could not stop what was coming. Still, the work gave shape to their waiting, and in that shape was strength. The next night, the riders finally came. He heard them first, the low thunder of hooves rolling across the plain, and the laughter, sharp and cruel, cutting through the dark. He stood in the yard with rifle raised, lantern light flickering behind him. The woman watched from the porch, her face pale in the glow, but her eyes unyielding. The riders circled the house slow, their horses restless in the shadows. There were 5 of them, each armed, each wearing the look of men who believed the land already belonged to them. Their leader rode closer, his voice rough as he called out. He said the ranch was wasted on one woman and a drifter with no name. He said the house would burn if they did not ride out by morning. His words carried easy confidence, the kind born of men who had taken without resistance before. The cowboy answered with silence. He stood tall, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the men before him. The leader spat, cursed, then laughed. He turned his horse and rode back to the others. Together, they circled once more before vanishing into the dark, leaving behind only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the hills. The silence after their departure was heavier than any noise. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his chest rising slow, each breath measured. The woman stepped down from the porch and stood beside him. Neither spoke. 4 words would not ease what lingered in the night. They knew the riders would return. And when they did, it would not be to talk. The following day was spent in preparation. Cowboy checked every round, loaded every weapon, and placed them within reach. He filled buckets with water, lined them near the porch, knowing fire would be one of the first weapons used. He showed the woman how to reload the rifle, how to brace against the recoil. Though she listened with the calm of someone who already understood more than she let on. She had been raised on this land, raised in hardship, raised to stand when others might break. The sun dipped low again, painting the fields red, and the air carried the promise of violence. As the last light faded, the riders returned. This time there was no laughter, no circling games. They rode straight to the gate, their horses restless, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. The leader called out once more, his words stripped of patience. He gave them a choice, to leave the land or be buried beneath it. The cowboy stepped forward, his voice steady, though his chest burned with the weight of it all. He said the land was not theirs to take, said the house would stand as long as he drew breath. His words cut sharp in the night, and for the first time the riders did not laugh. The silence after his defiance stretched long. Then, with a sudden cry, the leader raised his hand and the riders charged. The night exploded with hooves, with shouts, with the thunder of men who believed fear would break their enemy. But the cowboy did not move. He raised the rifle, fired once, and the first rider fell. The others scattered, circling wide, returning fire that tore splinters from the porch and set the windows rattling. The fight raged through the dark. Gunfire echoed across the land, flashes lighting the fields like lightning storms. The cowboy moved with grim precision, each shot placed with care, each breath measured. The woman reloaded as he had shown her, steady hands working in the glow of the lantern. Together, they held the house, each shot pushing back the tide of men who had thought the land an easy prize. Hours passed like minutes, until at last the riders broke, to lay still in the field, another wounded and crawling. The others turned their horses and vanished into the hills, their shouts fading into silence. The cowboy stood in the yard, rifle still in hand, chest heaving with exhaustion. The woman stepped to his side, her face pale but unshaken. Together they watched the horizon, waiting for more, but none came. The storm had broken and passed. When dawn rose, the land stretched quiet once more. Smoke hung faint where gunfire had sparked grass, but the fields stood unburned, the house unbroken. The cowboy walked among the fallen riders, his face heavy with the knowledge that such endings always carried a cost. He dug graves at the edge of the property, each stroke of the shovel a reminder of the weight of survival. The woman joined him, her silence steady, her presence a strength he had never known before. In the days that followed, the ranch returned to its stillness. The tracks faded, the air cleared, and the land seemed to breathe again. Yet nothing was the same. The woman carried herself with the same quiet strength, but her eyes held a new light, one born of having stood and endured. The cowboy felt it too, a shift deep in his bones. He had not ridden away. He had chosen to stay, to fight, to stand beside her when the storm came. And in that choice, something within him had changed. Word spread in town of the fight on the ranch. Some spoke in whispers of how the riders had been beaten, how the land had been defended by a lone drifter and a woman who refused to break. Others said more trouble would come, that men like those did not fall without brothers to avenge them. But the cowboy paid little mind to the whispers. He knew the truth. Trouble always rode somewhere on the horizon, but for now the ranch stood, for now they had peace. As spring deepened, new grass pushed through the soil, green and strong. The woman planted a small garden near the porch, her hands steady as she worked the earth. The cowboy helped mend the barn roof, his movements slower, more certain, as though he had finally accepted the weight of staying. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, no longer haunted by silence, but comforted by it. The night still stretched long, but they no longer carried the sharp edge of dread. One evening, as the sun set gold across the hills, the woman looked to him and asked if he would keep riding when the next season came. He thought for a long moment before answering. He said a man could spend his life chasing the horizon and still never catch it. He said maybe the time had come to stop chasing. She nodded, her eyes softening, her silence carrying more than words could. The land around them still carried scars, but scars were not the end. They were reminders of what had been endured. The cowboy knew there would always be storms, always men who lived by taking, always shadows on the horizon. But he also knew he would no longer face them alone. And so the ranch stood quiet as spring turned to summer, the house warm with the steady rhythm of two lives bound together not by words but by the choice to endure side by side. For 40 nights he had lingered, torn between love and death, and in the end he had chosen to stand. The land bore witness, the fields stretched wide, and the silence of the plains carried their story into the wind. The storm had come, and the storm had passed. What remained was not ruin, but the strength of a man and a woman who refused to be broken, and the memory of a choice that would not be forgotten.